The night smelled of blood and betrayal. Celine stood in the grand hall of her family's estate, her silver hair cascading down her back like liquid moonlight, her crimson eyes locked onto the cold faces of the people she once called kin. The air was thick with the scent of fear, but it was not hers, it was theirs. They would not meet her gaze. The vampire lords stood in a circle, cloaked in their velvets and silks, their pale hands adorned with rings of power. At their feet, Celine lay in chains, her wrists bound with silver, searing her delicate flesh. The pain was nothing compared to the hollowness in her chest. Her father spoke the words that sealed her fate. "She is yours now." From the shadows, a man stepped forward, a merchant of flesh, a dealer in nightmares. His black eyes gleamed as he ran a gloved hand down the length of his cane, assessing her as one would a prized animal. "A rare beauty," he murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. "She will fetch a high price in the markets." Celine did not struggle. She would not give them the satisfaction. But inside, a storm raged. The silver bit into her skin as the slavers dragged her through the halls, past the doors she would never walk through again. The cold night swallowed her whole, the scent of rain mixing with the iron tang of blood. The caged carriage rattled through the darkened roads, the torches outside casting flickering light upon the iron bars that enclosed her. Around her, other captives sat in silence, some beaten, some broken. Celine sat tall, her ethereal beauty untouched by the filth surrounding her. But the fire in her eyes burned dangerously. She was no lamb to be led to slaughter. The city disappeared behind them, swallowed by the endless forest. The howls began soon after. Low, guttural, primal. The horses grew restless. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons. Then, chaos. The first body hit the ground before the driver could scream. A massive shadow tore through the night, moving too fast for human eyes. The stench of blood thickened as the beast ripped through the guards like a storm of teeth and claws. The carriage door was wrenched from its hinges, and there, standing before her, bathed in the silver light of the moon, was a creature of pure dominance. A werewolf, but not just any werewolf. His golden eyes locked onto hers, burning with an untamed fire. His form was towering, all raw power and lethal grace, his body sculpted from war and hardship. His bare chest, streaked with blood not his own, rose and fell with each breath. Clawed hands flexed at his sides, muscles coiled as if he was holding himself back. Celine should have been afraid. Instead, she tilted her chin, meeting his gaze with something just as dangerous. His nostrils flared. His breathing deepened. The bond of predator and prey crackled between them, but neither stepped back. The other captives whimpered, scurrying into the corners of the carriage, but Celine remained still. The air between them thickened, charged with something far deadlier than fear. The werewolf stepped forward, his massive form blocking out the moon. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like thunder before a storm. "You don't belong in chains." Celine arched a delicate brow, her lips curving into the faintest smirk. "And yet, here I am." Something flickered in his golden eyes, something dark, something hungry. Without another word, he reached out, his clawed fingers curling around the silver chains binding her wrists. The metal sizzled against his skin, but he didn't flinch. With one effortless pull, the chains shattered. Celine watched as he bared his sharp teeth, as if daring her to run. She did not. Instead, she lifted her wrist, running her fingers over the bruised skin where the chains had been, before meeting his gaze once more. "You're bleeding," she murmured, her voice smooth as silk. The werewolf smirked, tilting his head. "I don't mind a little pain." The torches burned around them, painting their figures in firelight and shadow. The scent of death clung to the air, but between them, something else had begun to bloom, something dangerous, a predator and a goddess of the night, bound by fate, and neither of them could look away. The night pulsed with danger and desire. Celine stood beneath the towering trees, her silver hair glowing in the moonlight, her crimson eyes fixed on the man before her, the beast who had torn through flesh and steel to set her free. The forest was thick with the scent of blood, but all she could smell was him. A force of raw power. The werewolf towered over her, his golden eyes burning with something dark, something possessive. His bare chest, streaked with battle, rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. The tension between them crackled like a storm, unspoken but undeniable. "You should run," he rumbled, his voice thick with warning. Celine tilted her head, her lips curving into the ghost of a smile. "Do you want me to?" A growl rumbled deep in his chest, low and primal. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his presence swallowing the air itself. "I don't know what I want," he admitted, his voice rough, dangerous. "But I know you're testing me." Celine reached up, brushing the last remnants of broken chains from her wrists. Her movements were slow, deliberate, every inch the predator she was born to be. "And if I am?" His gaze flickered to her delicate fingers, the same fingers that could crush a man's heart with inhuman strength, the same fingers that traced patterns in the air like whispered promises of death. She was beautiful, deadly, and untamed. "I don't take kindly to being tested," he murmured, stepping even closer. Celine's breath hitched. He was too close now, his body radiating heat, his scent filling her senses. Earth, rain, and something undeniably male. She could feel the raw power in him, coiled like a beast barely held in check. "And yet," she whispered, lifting her gaze to his, "you're still standing here." His golden eyes darkened. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then, faster than she could anticipate, he reached out. Large, calloused fingers gripped her wrist, not to hurt, but to hold. The warmth of his skin against her cold flesh sent a strange, forbidden sensation through her. He was fire, she was ice, and yet neither pulled away. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. His grip tightened, as if testing the reality of her. "Ronan." The name suited him. Strong, fierce, untamed. Celine let her fingers trail up his forearm, her touch feather-light but deliberate. She felt the tension ripple through him, saw the way his pupils dilated at her nearness. "I should thank you, Ronan," she murmured, voice like silk, "for saving me." His thumb traced a slow circle against her skin, but his expression remained unreadable. "You don't seem like someone who needs saving." A small, knowing smile curved her lips. "No, but I think you do." Something snapped in the air between them. A dangerous, unseen thread stretched tight, ready to break. Ronan's chest rose with a sharp inhale. His grip on her wrist loosened but didn't release. "You don't know what I am." Celine lifted her free hand, resting her cool palm against his bare chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, powerful. But beneath it, something wild stirred. "I know exactly what you are." A breath. A pause. Then, a howl in the distance. Ronan's gaze sharpened, his muscles tensing. The pack was near. Celine sighed, stepping back just enough to let the moment slip between them, but not far enough to break the spell entirely. "Duty calls." His jaw clenched. "I have a pack to lead." She nodded, understanding more than she let on. "Then go." Ronan hesitated, a single heartbeat of indecision. His instincts screamed at him to stay, to claim, to take what was standing before him. But his duty whispered otherwise. Finally, with a last lingering glance, he turned, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. Celine watched him go, a strange ache settling in her chest. The werewolf had saved her. But what neither of them realized was that she had already begun to claim him. The forest was restless. Shadows stretched long beneath the silver light of the moon, whispering secrets between the trees. Ronan felt them watching, waiting, as if the night itself knew what he had done. He should have left her, should have walked away and never looked back. But he couldn't. The scent of her still clung to his skin, cool like the winter wind, laced with something darker, something forbidden. It burned in his veins, an ache that refused to fade. He had led his pack away, back to the safety of their territory. But his thoughts remained on the vampire girl with eyes like dying embers. Celine. She was dangerous. He had seen it in the way she moved, like a blade unsheathed, sharp and silent. And yet, when she looked at him, there had been something else. Not fear, not hatred. Something deeper, more primal. She had touched him. Ronan could still feel the ghost of her fingers against his chest, the way her voice had curled around his name like a spell. Now, standing at the edge of the river that marked his territory, he should have pushed her from his mind. Instead, he turned. He retraced his steps. Back to her. Celine knew he would come. She sat on the gnarled roots of an ancient tree, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders, glowing in the pale light. The night whispered of him before he even stepped into view. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the heat of his presence. He was close. Then he was there. A figure emerging from the dark, towering and unmistakable. Ronan stepped forward, golden eyes locked onto hers, his movements slow but deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. Celine smiled, tilting her head. "I thought you had a pack to lead." His jaw tightened. "I do. And yet, you're here." He didn't answer. Instead, he stalked closer, until the air between them was tight with unspoken tension. He loomed over her, his presence a storm she had no desire to escape. Celine rose to her feet, unfazed by his dominance. "What do you want, Ronan?" He exhaled slowly, as if restraining something untamed within him. "You." The word was rough, unwilling, but true. A shiver of something wicked ran down Celine's spine. She had been desired before, hunted even, but never like this, never with such raw hunger. She took a slow step toward him, her fingers ghosting over his forearm, tracing the hardened muscle beneath. "And if I told you I wanted you to?" A deep growl rumbled in his chest, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. He reached for her, grasping her wrist, pulling her closer. The contrast of his heat against her cooled skin was intoxicating. "You're playing with fire, vampire," he murmured, his breath brushing against her lips. Celine's smile was sharp. "Good. I like the way it burns." Something snapped. Ronan crushed her against him, his arms caging her, his grip firm but careful. Celine's breath hitched, but she didn't resist. Instead, she leaned in, letting the wildness of him consume her senses. His scent, earth and rain. His warmth, burning through her cold skin. His lips hovered just above hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. For a moment, the world was silent. The night held its breath. Then, a distant howl. A reminder. A warning. Ronan stiffened, the weight of his reality crashing back onto his shoulders. His pack. His duty. Celine felt the shift, saw the war behind his golden eyes. Slowly, she lifted a hand, tracing a single fingertip along his jawline, forcing him to look at her. "You can fight it," she whispered. His grip on her tightened, one last moment of hesitation. Then, with a frustrated growl, he released her, stepping back. Celine watched him, unshaken, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "This isn't over, Ronan." He said nothing, but they both knew the truth. It had only just begun. The night stretched long and restless. The moon hung low, veiled behind drifting clouds, casting shifting shadows over the land. Ronan stood at the edge of his territory, muscles tense, fists clenched. He had told himself to stay away, to forget the vampire girl who had unsettled something primal within him. But forgetting her was impossible. Celine, even her name haunted him. It was a whisper in the wind, a sensation lingering on his skin. The scent of her, cold, intoxicating, still clung to his senses like a drug he could not purge from his blood. She was a mistake, a danger, a temptation he should resist. And yet, His feet had already carried him back to her. Through the thick woods, he moved like a phantom, his golden eyes cutting through the dark. The place where he had left her was empty, the tree roots bare. For a moment, something like frustration flared in his chest. Then, a presence. He turned sharply, his body tensing a second before she emerged from the shadows like a specter born of the night. Celine. Her silver hair gleamed under the broken moonlight, cascading over her shoulders like liquid light. She stood poised, regal, yet untamed, her crimson eyes burning with something unreadable. "You came back," she murmured, her voice smooth as velvet. Ronan exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "You knew I would." A small, knowing smile curved her lips. "Yes." The space between them crackled like the air before a storm. His blood roared in his veins, demanding, restless. She was too close, too still, a creature of ice and shadow. Yet every instinct in him screamed to pull her into his heat, to claim what should never be his. Celine took a step forward, slow, deliberate. "Tell me, Wolf," she whispered, tilting her head. "What is it you truly want?" His breath was ragged, his restraint a frayed thread. "You already know." She reached for him then, her fingers feather-light as they trailed up his forearm, tracing the ridges of muscle beneath his skin. Cold against heat, night against fire. "I can hear your heartbeat," she mused, her touch sending a dangerous shiver through his body. "It's racing." His hand shot out, capturing her wrist in a firm grip. "You think you're in control of this, don't you?" His voice was low, rough, edged with something dark. Celine's smile deepened. "Aren't I?" In a heartbeat, he had her against the tree, his body caging hers, the heat of him suffocating. Her breath hitched, but she did not struggle. She only looked up at him through thick lashes, unafraid, as if daring him to break first. Ronan's fingers tightened around her wrist, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. "You're playing a dangerous game, vampire." Celine's lips parted slightly, her voice a whisper against his skin. "Then stop me." His grip faltered, because he couldn't. The pull between them was unbearable, a force neither of them could deny. His fingers trailed up her arm, tracing the curve of her shoulder, his touch firm yet reverent. Celine shivered under his heat, her lips parting as if she, too, were losing the battle against the inevitable. Ronan leaned in, their breath mingling, the warmth of him melting into the cold of her. His voice was raw when he spoke. "This will ruin us both." Celine's lashes fluttered. "Then let it." Something inside him snapped. He crushed his lips to hers, fierce and claiming, his grip tightening as if she might disappear if he let go. Celine melted into him, cold fire against searing heat, her fingers tangling into his hair, pulling him deeper. The world faded. The night, the war between their kinds, the warnings screaming in his mind. It all fell away. There was only her, only this, a hunger that could never be sated, a desire that could never be denied, and a love that could only lead to ruin. The night was thick with silence, the kind that held secrets between the trees. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of earth, and something darker, something untamed. Ronan stood near the edge of the river, his reflection rippling in the moonlit water. His fists clenched at his sides, his body still charged with the fire of the vampire's touch. Celine, her name alone was enough to unravel him. He should have left her behind, should have let reason guide him. Instead, he had taken her into his arms, into his mouth, into the hunger he could no longer control. And now, no matter how much he tried to force her from his mind, she was there, woven into his thoughts, his blood, his very bones. A soft sound broke the night. Ronan stiffened. His golden eyes flicked upward, sharp as a predator's, and there she was, watching him. Celine stood on the opposite bank, her silver hair cascading like starlight over her shoulders, her crimson eyes gleaming in the darkness. She was motionless, untouched by the cold wind that stirred the trees around them, a creature of the night, ethereal and unearthly, yet so painfully real to him now. He should have told her to leave, to go back to whatever world she had come from. But he didn't. Instead, he watched as she stepped forward, bare feet kissing the damp earth, moving toward him with the grace of something not entirely human. The river was no barrier. She glided over the water as if it were solid ground, her form dissolving into mist and reforming on the other side. Closer. His breath caught as she reached him, the scent of her invading his lungs, cold, sweet, intoxicating. "You're running from me," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. Ronan exhaled harshly, his jaw tightening. "I'm running from what you make me feel." Celine's lips curved, a knowing smile that sent a dangerous heat through his veins. "And what do I make you feel, Wolf?" His fingers twitched, the urge to touch her battling against his instincts. She was a vampire. She was danger. She was everything. His. The thought slammed into him like a violent storm, shaking him to his core. He had spent his life believing vampires were nothing more than enemies, soulless creatures of the dark. But Celine, she was something else, something neither of them had words for. "I should hate you," he rasped. Celine lifted her delicate fingers and traced the sharp line of his jaw, her touch like ice against his burning skin. "But you don't." He caught her wrist, holding her there, his grip firm but not cruel. His pulse pounded beneath her fingers, and she pressed against it, feeling the life that burned so fiercely within him. "No," he admitted, his voice low, almost guttural. "I don't." Celine's eyes darkened with something unreadable, something just as dangerous as the fire in his own. She stepped closer, their bodies nearly touching. "Then stop fighting it." A growl rumbled in his chest. "You don't know what you're asking." Her fingers curled around his hand, her cool skin a stark contrast to his heat. "I know exactly what I'm asking." The space between them collapsed. Ronan moved before he could stop himself, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her flesh against him. Celine let out a breathless sound, her lips parting as he bent his head, his mouth brushing the cold skin of her throat. His pulse roared, his instincts screaming to claim, to mark, to make her his in every way. Celine's fingers tangled into his hair, sharp nails grazing his scalp, sending a shudder down his spine. "I am not afraid of you, Ronan," she whispered. His teeth clenched. "You should be." Her lips brushed his ear, her voice a seductive whisper. "And yet, here I stand." Ronan's control snapped. His lips crashed against hers, claiming, demanding, consuming. Celine melted into him, her cold against his heat, her hunger answering his own. They were fire and ice, night and day, predator and prey. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They were only what they had always been. Two souls caught in something unstoppable, something that would either set them free or destroy them both. The wind howled through the forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and blood. The storm had passed, but the air was thick with the aftermath, the trees glistening with raindrops like shattered glass. In the darkness, Ronan stood at the entrance of the old ruin, his broad frame silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Inside, Celine waited. She sat on the stone ledge, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders, her crimson eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Her beauty was haunting, a kind that did not belong in this world, a beauty born of darkness and eternity. And yet, he could not look away. The werewolf stepped forward, his boots heavy against the stone floor. His golden eyes burned as they locked onto her, his body thrumming with an energy he could barely contain. She had become his obsession, his torment, his ruin. Celine watched him with an unreadable expression, her fingers lightly tracing the fabric of the cloak draped over her lap, the very cloak he had given her. It smelled of him, of the wild, of warmth she had long forgotten. "You followed me," she murmured, her voice like the whisper of midnight. Ronan didn't answer. He couldn't. He had told himself to leave, to break free of this madness before it consumed him whole. But the moment she vanished into the night, something primal inside him had snapped. He needed her. Celine's lips curved, sensing his struggle. "You fear what you feel for me." His jaw tightened. He was not a man easily undone. He had fought wars, spilled blood, torn through enemies with claw and fang. But she was undoing him in ways he had never thought possible. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his large hands gripping the edge of the ledge she sat upon, caging her in. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. Instead, she tilted her head, offering him that same knowing smile, as if she had already won whatever silent battle waged between them. "You think this is a game." His voice was low, dangerous. Celine leaned in, her cool breath gusting over his skin. "No, Ronan. I think this is fate." His hands clenched. His entire body burned with the need to claim, to own, to mark her as his and end this torment. But she was no ordinary woman. She was a creature of the night, one that should have been his enemy. And yet, here they stood. Celine reached out, her fingers brushing against his chest, over the pounding heart beneath. "You want me," she whispered, her voice a melody of sin and seduction. Ronan's breath was ragged. "I shouldn't." She smiled, her fangs barely visible. "But you do." His control shattered. With a growl, he seized her wrist, pulling her against him. She gasped softly, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a dangerous hunger that mirrored his own. His fingers tightened at her waist, pressing her against his solid frame, heat meeting cold in a clash that sent fire through his veins. Celine's hands traced up his chest, slow and deliberate, her icy touch searing him in ways it shouldn't. "You fight against it," she murmured, her lips inches from his. "But the truth is, Ronan, you were always meant to be mine." Something inside him snapped. His lips crashed against hers, fierce and demanding, his dominance meeting her defiance in a battle neither of them wished to win. Celine melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she returned his kiss with equal hunger. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only this war between fire and ice, between mortal and immortal, between a beast and the woman who had enslaved him without chains. Ronan pulled back, his breath heavy, his golden eyes wild with something primal. "You don't know what you've done to me, Celine." She smiled, tracing a single cold finger down his jaw. "Oh, what I do, my wolf." And gods help them both. She was never letting him go. The night hung thick with silence, broken only by the distant howls of wolves and the rustling of the midnight wind through the ruins. The moon cast a silver glow upon the ancient stone, illuminating the two figures locked in a silent war of desire and restraint. Ronan stood with his fists clenched at his sides, his breath ragged, his body burning with something he could no longer deny. The scent of her was in his lungs, cold, intoxicating, dangerous. Celine stood before him, poised like a goddess of the night, her crimson eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Say it," she whispered, stepping closer, her voice a blade against his skin. Ronan growled, his golden eyes ablaze with the battle waging inside him. "You think this is a game, Celine." She smirked, tilting her head, her silver hair cascading like liquid moonlight. "No, Ronan, I think this is a bond you cannot break." His jaw tightened. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to take her, to claim her as his and end this torment. But she was a vampire, his kind's sworn enemy. And yet here she was, standing in the ruins of a world that had tried to break them both, daring him to surrender to the truth they could no longer ignore. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he snarled, stepping forward. Celine's breath hitched as he closed the distance between them, his towering presence drowning her in heat. She could feel the raw power thrumming beneath his skin, the caged beast within him clawing to be set free. But she did not move. "I know exactly what I'm doing to you," she whispered, reaching out to trace a single icy finger along the rough line of his jaw. You are fighting against a fate already written in blood, my wolf. Ronan grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but careful, as if even in his fury he feared breaking her. Do not call me yours, Celine. She smiled, stepping even closer until she could feel the heat of his breath against her lips. But you are mine, Ronan, just as I am yours. His control shattered. With a growl, he pulled her flush against him, his grip possessive, unyielding. The cold of her body burned against his heat, the contrast igniting something primal between them. Do you even understand what you're asking for? He rasped, his fingers tightening at her waist. Celine's gaze softened, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. I do. A heartbeat of silence passed between them, one final chance to turn away, to end what should have never begun. But neither of them moved. Ronan exhaled sharply, his forehead pressing against hers. This will destroy us. Celine closed her eyes, her fingers tracing over his chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat. Then let it. With a low snarl, Ronan tilted her head back, his lips costing over her throat, where the pulse of ancient power hummed beneath the surface. His grip on her tightened, his beast demanding to mark her, to bind her to him in a way no force in the world could sever. Celine sighed, her fingers tangling into his dark hair, pulling him closer. Do it. Ronan's fangs elongated, his breath warm against her skin. He had never wanted anything more. But before he could seal their bond in blood, a sudden violent crash shattered the moment. The ruins trembled. The scent of death filled the air. Ronan's head snapped up, his body moving instinctively to shield Celine as a dark figure emerged from the shadows. A voice, thick with malice, echoed through the ruins. You truly thought you could escape fate. Celine stiffened. Ronan's claws extended. The past had found them, and it was hungry for vengeance. The ruins trembled beneath their feet. A cold wind howled through the broken stone arches, carrying the scent of death and decay. Ronan stood protectively in front of Celine, his golden eyes burning with fury, his claws flexing as he bared his fangs at the dark figure emerging from the shadows. The stranger stepped forward, a vampire, ancient and cruel, his presence thick with the weight of centuries. His crimson eyes locked onto Celine, filled with cold amusement. You were promised to us, Celine, he said smoothly, his voice like poisoned silk. Did you think you could escape your fate? Celine stiffened, but her face remained unreadable. I was never yours to claim, she said, her voice sharp as steel. The vampire smirked. And yet, here you stand, bound to a beast. How disappointing. His gaze flicked to Ronan, filled with contempt. A werewolf? You shame your bloodline. Celine. Ronan growled low in his throat, the sound primal, a warning. His body coiled like a predator ready to strike. Say another word, and I will rip it from your throat. The vampire chuckled, unshaken. Brave words, dog. Celine stepped closer to Ronan, her fingers brushing against his arm, a silent reminder that he was not alone in this fight. Her touch sent a shiver through him, cool, electric, grounding him even as his rage boiled. The vampire's smirk faded. Enough of this. You belong to the elders, Celine. You were sold to us. You have no right to defy your destiny. Celine's eyes darkened. And yet, I do. She moved like a phantom, faster than a whisper, her dagger flashing as she lunged. The vampire barely had time to react before her blade sliced across his cheek, black blood welling from the wound. He staggered back, hissing in pain. Ronan took the opening. With a snarl, he lunged, his claws tearing into the vampire's chest, sending him crashing into the stone ruins. Dust and rubble exploded around them as the vampire screamed in agony. Celine watched, unflinching. You made a mistake coming here, she said coldly. The vampire's body convulsed, his wounds already knitting together. He bared his fangs, his hatred palpable. You think you can fight them all? He spat, The elders will never stop hunting you. You will never be free. Ronan stepped forward, his breath heavy, his beast barely restrained. Then let them come, he growled, and I will tear through every last one of them. The vampire's crimson eyes flickered with something almost like fear. He knew Ronan was not bluffing. Without another word, he vanished into the night, his body dissolving into a dark mist. But his parting words lingered. They will come for you, Celine. And when they do, you will beg for mercy. The ruins fell silent once more. Ronan turned to Celine. She looked up at him, her face unreadable, but he could hear the rapid beat of her heart. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek, his touch rough, protective. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She exhaled softly, her lips parting. "No," she whispered, "not with you." The bond between them pulsed, unbreakable, undeniable. Ronan leaned in, his forehead pressing against hers. His beast demanded to mark her, to claim her as his forever. And this time, he would not resist. Celine tilted her head, baring her throat to him in silent surrender. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest as he pressed his lips to her skin, his fangs scraping teasingly. She shivered, her fingers curling into his chest. "You are mine, Celine," he murmured against her pulse. "As I am yours." The blood oath had been spoken. The battle was far from over. But under the silver moon, they had already won.